how serious is voter fraud? Or is it something we should even be worried about in spite of the hype?
Well, let's put it in some perspective. There are about 32,000 incidences of UFO sightings over the course of the last, say, 6-7 years. There's been about 350 instances of people being struck by lightning. There have been 9 instances, 9, of possible voter impersonation. So this is a non-issue that has been blown up to the extent that it is stifling and intimidating voters across the nation.
Now, how is it possible, please tell me, that people would be upset if there are only 9 instances?
Well, I mean, obviously there are partisan issues here, and this is what we're talking about when we talk about suppression of the vote. The people that would need to present photo ID are typically poor, the elderly. They tend to vote Democratic, and so it is not in the Republican Party's interest to have those people enfranchised, and so they are targeted in ways that people who don't have the ID, who don't think of traveling overseas, so they don't have a passport, they don't own a car, so they have no reason to have a driver's license. And so for what many of us may be as simple as reaching in our pocket is really quite a burden for the poor and the elderly and disproportionately people of color.
Okay, Robert,
that's the
thank
problem.
you. Now, he says it's a partisan issue. Do you think it's a partisan issue? Do you think there should be legitimate concern in terms of the suppression of voters with the ID requirements?
One thing I think we should do is make a clear distinction between voter identification, those issues, and voter suppression issues. Because as we have seen in some of the recent elections, most notably the year 2000, particularly in Florida, there have been efforts to purge rolls or to keep the voting participation down through a variety of means. And that, I think, while I'm not an expert in that area, just as an intelligent person reading the news and so forth, I think we all would recognize that efforts need to be made to preserve the right to vote and make sure that voters who are entitled to vote and want to vote are able to vote.
Phyllis.
I think many people just can't see that there is an issue for people with a voter ID. They can't understand why you just can't go into the voting booth, the registrar, not the registrar's place, but into the election poll and hand over your ID that you have in your pocket. They just don't understand that as an issue. Why shouldn't you? But actually there are other mechanisms in place to assure that people are not going from place to place to place in voting.
Before we talk about those mechanisms, let me just briefly read what one person on the right has said in terms of voter ID laws. And the question this person poses, he says, we live in a world that requires photo ID to do practically everything, from buying movie tickets, signing up for college classes, getting a job, buying a car, buying a house, and a million of other things. So why, given the fact that voting is one of the most important things we can do, why do people then complain about having voters show an ID?
Because there's a large segment of our society that isn't looking for a job because they're retired and they don't own a car, so they have no reason to have a driver's license, for whom it would be onerous to secure photo ID, never mind they'd have to pay for it.
Why would it be onerous?
Well, think of an 85-year-old woman who is retired and doesn't have a car and doesn't get around very easily.
So would she be exceptional? I mean, how many 85-year-old women are we talking about who would be affected by voter requiring a voter
probably
ID?
enough to make a difference in a lot of elections.
Okay,
Yeah.
Bob?
One of the issues I think we should keep in mind is that there are 2 steps to the voting process. There's the registration step, and then there's the actual voting step. And the registration step is where people are supposed to produce some evidence that they are in fact a citizen and that they have an address that they can be registered at. Then when the time comes to vote, you have the time pressures of wanting to get a large number of people through the polls, particularly in the early morning hours because people need to get to jobs, or in the lunchtime hour, or even more so in the waning hours before the polls close. You don't want to have onerous regulations or steps there that keep people from voting.
But at the same time, you don't want to have people voting who shouldn't be voting.
But that's
So Phyllis, you said that there are some safeguards already in place.
So
what are those safeguards?
First, you are registered to vote ahead of time, and you sign a form. And when you sign that form today, they record that electronically. When you go in to vote, then you sign the registrar when you go in. There's a big register, and it says your address, and you tell the person your address and your name, and they look it up, and they're looking up to see if what you're asking is what's coming up on the sheet of paper. And then you have to sign that. And at the end, when that gets turned in, that's checked. At the end of the day, that book goes back to the registrar's office, and they check to make sure that those signatures are signatures that match what they have in the office.
But in the meantime, the vote has already been counted,
Right.
right? So let us say 100 people signed falsely. Their votes have already been counted.
It would be, remember he said 9 cases. When you come into the polling place, you only have 300 or 400 or 500 people voting. 500 would be a huge amount in your polling place to begin with, and you have a lot of people there. It would be extremely difficult to do that. What are you going to do? Go from one polling place to the next and guess what they are, and then you'd have all those different signatures? Then you'd be in a case of fraud, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, this is a solution looking for a problem.
So why is it then, I read someplace at least 20 states have attempted to enact voter ID laws.
Well, because
and you're going to say it's only people on the right who want to disenfranchise minority voters or the elderly? Or
you said it, but I would probably agree with it.
and
I mean, we had an instance of a top Republican official in Pennsylvania who flat out said, imposition of photo ID requirements in the state of Pennsylvania will win the state for Mitt Romney. He said it. That wasn't me. He said it himself. Look, we've always struggled with the issue of the right to vote. I mean, the 15th Amendment was passed in the wake of the Civil War. People died for that right to vote. And even 150 years later, we still struggle with it. In the 60s, 3 civil rights workers were murdered for one reason. They were registering black folks to vote. It wasn't until 1920 that we passed the 19th Amendment allowing women the right to vote. We were a country for however many years that is, almost 150 years at that point.
okay, so some might say we may very well have gone, the pendulum might have swung too far, and those on the right say, well, the Democrats and the liberals don't want to have voter ID laws because there are a lot of undocumented people in this country, and those people would be more prone to vote for the Democratic Party.
Undocumented immigrants?
Yes.
That's one of the biggest red herrings in this. An undocumented immigrant, the last thing that they want to do is present themselves to public authorities. They are here in the country without documentation. They're here without legal status, and the last thing they want to do is expose themselves. So again,
well, if they're signing somebody's name, is that exposing themselves?
Well, sure. I mean, it's punishable by a felony.
And then if you have a criminal record, you go.
Yeah. I think, kind of speaking in a mediator's point of view about this, number one, we all have an interest in the sanctity of the voting process so that it is not conducted fraudulently. But we also have an interest as Americans in the inclusiveness of the process. And so what the laws have done so far is to have this 2 steps where someone registers and their identification is checked and they have an address, and then when they come in to vote, there's a check against that information and they are allowed to vote. If you impose onerous requirements at the time of voting, what you end up with then is long lines and people not being able, and backlogs and so forth, not being able to get to the polls.
Bob, I think you've made an assumption because you started out by saying we all have an interest, more or less, in protecting everybody's right to vote and making sure it's not a fraudulent process.
Right.
And some people would say, no, that's not true. Those on the right would say the Democrats are more interested in turning out as many voters as possible because there are more people who would be then voting democratically for the Democrats. And those on the left would say, no, it's those on the right who want to suppress the vote.
And if
so
a problem,
not everybody,
two different issues.
Not everybody.
We have mixed interests here.
Yes,
we
we
have
do.
a common
and the parties
interest.
have mixed interests.
We have a common interest in seeing our democracy work and our institutions work. And they work best when there is full participation. We have separate interests because of our alignment with particular parties in hoping that our party does well or is able to elect its candidates. And what I'm suggesting here is that we keep uppermost what I think is the most important of those issues, and that's the first one, the sanctity of the voting process and the health and vibrancy and effectiveness of our voting institutions.
Phyllis.